Thank you guys for having me, and thank you for staying this late for the last talk. I know it's been a long day, long couple of days. It's very hot outside, so I appreciate you. I'm Zhivko. I'm part of a company called LimeChain. We built blockchain infrastructure and applications since 2017. And today I'm going to talk about alternative virtual machines in the Ethereum ecosystem. Very quick outline. So I'm going to start with a very brief intro of the EVM, talk about its limitations, talk about some of the alternative virtual machines that we have out there today, show you practical examples how they compare to the Ethereum virtual machine in Solidity, do some pros and cons, and then leave time for Q&A. So if you're a technical person, I think this should be interesting for you. If you're not a technical person, don't worry, I try to keep this really high level, so I think this should be an easy presentation for all levels. But before we begin, I would still like to understand my audience a bit better. So really quickly, show of hands, who knows what's a virtual machine? Nice, that's great. Who has deployed a contract on the Ethereum virtual machine? Nice, almost everyone. Who has paid high gas fees on Ethereum? Everyone, nice. Great, so I love this. Really quickly, I guess you guys know, but basically the EVM is the thing that executes the smart contract, so everyone sees the same outcome. Basically, developers write code in smart contracts in Solidity, they'll compile it with developer tools, and then it gets into bytecode, which is then executed on the EVM. That's really roughly how the EVM works. So it's been really established, and why do we need alternative virtual machine? It's really simple. You can launch your own L1 or L2 coin with your alternative virtual machine, and it's great. Of course, it's a joke. The EVM has a lot of limitations. First of all, it's 10 years old, and it was the first smart contract. It's powering the first smart contract blockchain, so we cannot expect the first thing to be perfect. We've seen it fail many times, even though it's the most trusted virtual machine. One of its biggest limitations is that it processes transactions sequentially, which is really cumbersome. So it verifies transactions one after another and not in parallel. Gas efficiency can be a trouble a lot of times, especially for things that require a lot of computation. Storage can be trouble. Contract size limitations can be a trouble, and then you depend on Solidity, which can be quite restrictive for a lot of developers. Even our Lord and Savior, Vitalik, recently suggested that at some point we should migrate from the EVM. He suggested RISC-V as an alternative. In his opinion, RISC-V would enable smart contracts to be written in Rust, even though he doesn't like Rust. They would, of course, still support Solidity smart contracts, but this is one of the ideas to transcend EVM at this point. Obviously, something like this will take a lot of time to actually happen, and we cannot expect it in the next 1, 2, or maybe even 3 years. But it's a good start to open up the discussion in this direction, and we're going to talk more about that in a bit. So why do we actually need alternative VMs? Scalability and performance is one part, to be able to process more transactions for less cost. Security is another. Alternative virtual machines can prevent things like reentrancy attacks, which are really common in Solidity, and we've seen a lot of hacks happen due to reentrancy attacks. Storage efficiency I already mentioned, and developer flexibility. By going beyond the EVM, we can empower developers beyond Solidity in other languages, whether it's Rust, Go, C, whatever. So, what kind of alternative VMs we can have in Ethereum? Most of you know this, but it can be an L2 that has a completely different virtual machine, like Starknet, Fuel. We're going to talk more about those. It can be an L2 that supports multiple virtual machines. A good example for this is Arbitrum Stylus, Aztec as well. We're going to cover those. What I'm not going to talk about is ZK-based EVMs, because they're essentially EVM compatible and pretty similar. They just use ZK proofs for scalability. I'm not going to talk other ones like the SVM, move-based ones, etc., or EVM forks like Monad and Berachain. And I'm also not going to talk about succinct SP1 and RISC-0, which are great, but they're mostly using ZKs to create. They enable ZK proofs to create blockchains, and they're not blockchains themselves that you can write smart contracts in. So, really quickly, alternative VML2s. If we look at Starknet, for example, they said, okay, the EVM is quite cumbersome. We need to scale Ethereum. We're going to create our L2, but in order to make it performant, we need to use another language and forget about EVM. And so they created Cairo VM. It's based on the Cairo language. Is somewhat similar to Rust, and they use ZK Starks for scalability and ZK proofs, but it's not EVM compatible. This is a trade-off. Similar things with Fuel. They have their own Fuel VM. It's somewhat similar to the Solana virtual machine, but at least inspired. They use the smart contract language called Sway. Their superpower is basically they enable parallel executions of transactions for scalability. However, they're not EVM compatible. What's, I think, a bit more interesting, or at least from my perspective, are things like multi-VM L2s, namely Arbitrum Stylus and Aztec. Arbitrum Stylus was really interesting because they basically created a virtual machine that compiles to WASM. It runs in parallel to the EVM, and this means that developers can now write smart contracts in languages like Rust, Go, Python, C, etc. And it's completely EVM compatible, so you can write a Rust smart contract and deploy it on the Arbitrum One mainnet, which is really cool. And I'm going to show you some benchmark of smart contracts, how they perform in terms of gas costs compared to Solidity and the EVM. And Aztec is another example where they use an alternative virtual machine for a specific function or application. They actually have a public and a private virtual machine because their focus or main value proposition is privacy. However, they use the language called Noir, again, Rust-inspired, and they're not EVM compatible, but their whole focus is privacy. So, in practice, what we did is we took two smart contracts. One is a standard ERC20 contract, and one is ED25519, which is a cryptographic signature. The reason we used it is more computationally heavy, so and we wanted to see how a Rust smart contract written and deployed on Arbitrum is going to perform against Solidity smart contracts in terms of gas costs. What we found out is that for ERC20s, actually Solidity and EVM is more efficient. It costs less gas to mint and basically use ERC20s. However, for ED25519, which is more computationally heavy, it's much more efficient to do it in Rust. The conclusion here is that alternative VMs can be, and specifically Rust smart contracts, could be much more efficient or preferred for more computationally heavy things compared to simpler things like an ERC20. And we're looking forward to seeing more experiments with Arbitrum Stylus as well. So to sum it up, pros and cons of alternative virtual machines. So they can help with scalability and performance. They can have a specific function like privacy or app chains. They can also offer developer flexibility, meaning that you can empower developers from a wide set of languages, not just Solidity. And oftentimes, this can be better for more computationally heavy things. On the other hand, alternative virtual machines are oftentimes not EVM compatible, which is a big breaker. They're often on L2s, which fragment liquidity and make UX worse, at least for now, because they're not interoperable. New languages, again, can be a barrier and take time to learn or adapt to, like Cairo, Sway, and a bunch of others. And they're not battle tested yet. Again, I think most of the alternative virtual machines and the L2s are not more than 2 years old, while the EVM is, I think, 10 years old now. And albeit lacks performance at times, it's really battle tested, and most of the risks associated with are pretty known up to now. So, will the EVM get replaced? My short answer is no, or at least in the short term. However, it can lose a bit of market share to alternative VML1s, such as Solana, the Move ones, etc. In the long term, we may actually see a shift towards other virtual machines. Like I mentioned already, the Vitalik post about RISC-V. It has really sparked a lot of discussion. For example, you can see the Starknet community saying that RISC-V is not an efficient virtual machine. They should use something else. Again, I think Ethereum, by Ethereum I mean the foundation and the core developer community, they have come to the realization that the L1 needs to scale despite the emergence of L2s. And they are going to do it, or at least try to do it, but it's going to take a lot of time. And one way to do that would probably be transitioning beyond the EVM, but I think things stay the same for at least the next 2 or 3 years. That's pretty much the talk. Happy to engage in some Q&A if you guys have. So yeah.
Nope. Ah, there is one.
Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask you, what do you see is the main driver besides performance that you see in alt VMs? Main driver for adoption?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think performance is a good enough reason, to be honest. The second, I guess secondary reason could be application-specific things, but I guess those at some point would lead back to performance. And what I mean by performance, it's not only the virtual machine. I'm seeing a more wider transition industry-wide towards Rust-based infrastructure, mainly because of performance. For example, we talked to a lot of L2s. A lot of them want to transition slowly their whole stack to Rust, including a Rust-based node, like Red, for example. You can see developer tools migrating to Rust, and industry-wide, I see a shift towards Rust, mainly because of performance, because at the end of the day, most of the usage on blockchains is still financial transactions, or at least trading to some extent. And for this, you need performance. And you can see that even if we go beyond Ethereum, all of the new L1s, or at least the one that have some kind of adoption and performance, they are more or less Rust.
Okay, any more questions? Or follow-up? Ah, another one. Okay, yeah.
Sorry. I'm not super acquainted with alt VMs, but when you say VM in that context, do you usually mean the storage and the integrity level, such as MPT in Ethereum, or would that change as well? Like, would the switch of a VM for Ethereum or an alt VM, would it incur also completely different calculations of the state roots?
Yeah. It's a good question. To be honest, I don't know, or I can make an assumption. I think before switching, if we look at the Ethereum L1, before switching to another virtual machine like RISC-V, they're going to try to do what's possible to scale it without this. For example, even in L2s, there has been discussion about raising gas limits and whatnot. So short answer, honest answer is I don't know, and we'll have to see.
Okay, anything else? Another follow-up? Nope. Okay, if that is it, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
One more.